Hello and welcome to the Fit to Transform podcast, where you learn how to train and diet effectively and, most importantly, how to maintain those results for life, once and for all. I'm Nikias Tomasiello, a transgender training and nutrition coach working online with anyone who's ready for a true lifestyle transformation, anywhere they may be in the world. As a friendly reminder, any and all information provided is for educational purposes only. You should consult with your doctor before implementing any changes to your diet and exercise program. With that disclaimer out of the way, thank you for being here. Now grab yourself a cup of tea or pre-workouts and enjoy. Yo, dear listeners, hello and welcome back to the podcast. Today, I have a brand new guest. Nope, that did not work out well. Brand new guest. And this is Ben Yanes. Ben, welcome to the show.
Nikias, thanks for having me on. I'm excited for whatever we're going to chat about today. It could go in any direction. It could get wild, but I'm here for it.
What I'm planning on doing is I'm planning on asking you all about how to execute exercises in a more effective way. And I'm going to start with the upper body and we'll try to go through as many muscles as we can. My aim is still quality over quantity. But when I have a new guest on, I always want them to introduce themselves to my listeners. So my first question is, who are you? What do you do? And why are you so awesome at it?
Well, I can't speak to the last one if that's true or not, but my name is Ben. The elevator pitch version of who I am, where I've come from, is that I played sports for a very, very long time. Eventually, I stopped because I wasn't good enough to play in college. And at that point, I became lifting obsessed, as many of us do, and eventually worked my way into the online and in person personal training space. All along the way, I was doing my best to learn about the physics and the anatomy of exercise, a term we call biomechanics, which is basically just a fancy term to explain those things: forces, bones, muscles, all those things together. And because I was studying all along the way, I was basically studying for years and years and years just to kind of help myself and my clients. But eventually I kind of got bored of that. And so I started working with coaches themselves. And now basically what I do is I help to educate coaches so that they can better coach their clients based on, we'll say, concepts related to physics and anatomy rather than guesswork. That's one kind of main part of my job. I would say the other part is just as a general content creator, I reach a lot of people who are just into bodybuilding recreationally, lifting recreationally, which I think is probably the vast majority of people who are scrolling on Instagram looking for information. So I just make general posts about, hey, here's how you target this muscle, here's this mistake for this muscle, and all those sorts of things. So I speak to a variety of people, mainly coaches and trainers, and in a more in-depth setting, but then also just the average person who wants to grow muscle. I'm kind of the guy that just describes, hey, this is how you do this thing for this particular goal, which I'm sure we'll get into today.
Thank you for the introduction. Dear listeners, from my perspective, I found out about Ben a few months ago now, and I am currently under his mentorship or tutelage. He has a 7-week biomechanics live mentorship that I have signed up for, and I am finding it incredibly educational. And I really like how you, Ben, break exercises down on social media because you make bite-sized content and it's not easy to describe exercises in such a simple and understandable way as you do in a few minutes on a reel or on YouTube. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, me too. And I appreciate that compliment. That's kind of my main goal. And I think the thing that I've improved on most over the years is just making things more simple. I am someone who has the temptation to try to make things more complicated than they need to be. So I appreciate that because that is the highest compliment that one can receive in my position.
I could understand that completely because I'm quite brainy and I tend to overthink things and I like to use big words, but I've learned over the years that they're not always helpful. And before we get into the practical exercise conversation, I want to start with a theoretical question to set the tone. And I'm wondering, when you're thinking about how to execute an exercise yourself, or when you're thinking about how to explain to someone how to execute it, what is your goal?
Well, the first thing that I would say is I always try to imagine I'm talking to a single person, especially with content. Even if 10 people see it, you're ultimately trying to talk to one person. So content's a little bit of a different thing. But if I'm working with someone in person, or if I myself are thinking about how do I really build an exercise from the ground up, I always work backward from what am I trying to do. Very much like anything else in life, you got to kind of know what direction you're going, at least vaguely, before you start to actually move anywhere. So the goal is essentially to start with the goal and then to try to basically use an understanding of the basic physics, the basic anatomy to reverse engineer uh, an exercise based on where you want to end up. So, for example, uh, one thing that many people will be familiar with, their biceps, right? Their biceps. What do their biceps do? Well, among a few other things, the biceps bend the elbow, right? So if I know, okay, I want to target my biceps, I know that I need to do some kind of exercise where I'm bending my elbow. And then I basically just have to figure out, okay, what is the appropriate force setup that I can use to target my biceps? And we know just from experience, well, okay, it's not a triceps pushdown, right? Even though I'm just bending my elbow in a triceps pushdown, the load direction has to be pulling me into the elbow straightened position, not the elbow bent position. So without getting more into the weeds than that, I would just say you always have to start with that question of what am I trying to do? I think that's the point at which most people go wrong. They don't even have an idea of what they want to do to begin with. And then from there, you can sort of take a few steps back, and it doesn't have to be overly complicated. It can be as simple as the biceps bend the elbow. Therefore, I'm going to do some kind of activity where my elbow is bending. Of course, nuances to that, but we can, I'm sure, get into those if you have any sort of follow up on that. But that's where I would start. Start with the end goal, reverse engineer from there, and just keep it simple and keep it practical in your head in application.
That makes perfect sense. And what I want to do now, as we take the conversation towards specific muscle groups, is I'm going to ask at least one question that I find a lot of people tend to struggle with about a specific exercise for a specific muscle, and then open up the conversation a bit more towards general considerations on how to execute lifts with a muscle group in mind. And since the first muscle I want to cover is chest, and the first question I have is about what to do when somebody feels more their shoulders or their triceps when they're doing a chest press. My question, my theoretical question before that even comes into play is how important do you think that it is to feel a muscle group when we're executing a lift?
Mm. So I think in terms of how important is it to feel a target muscle, I would actually almost step in a different direction when answering that question. And I would start with what do I really not want to feel, right? Because what to feel can mean different things to different people. Like, do I feel it more in like the upper part of my chest or the lower part of my chest? That can really easily get people thinking too much. What I find more helpful is what do I definitely not want to feel? So if I'm doing an exercise and I expect that I'll feel my chest, but in the example you mentioned, I only feel my shoulders, I only feel my elbows, I only feel my triceps. I basically just feel everything except for the thing that I expected to. Well, I know that I'm a little bit off the mark. So as long as that box is checked, I'm not super concerned about how much or how little we're feeling the target tissue, just from the perspective of if I know that I have the appropriate physics set up, i.e., if I'm doing a push up, there's only a couple muscles that can perform a push up. So if I'm not really overly feeling my elbows, my triceps, my shoulders, and I'm kind of sort of feeling it in my chest, that's good enough for me. I think one example for people to think about in terms of making this conversation make more sense is I'm sure at least some of your listeners have done like a really heavy squat or really heavy deadlift or something like that. Right? When you're doing those exercises, when your body is functioning at its peak capacity from a force output perspective, you actually feel very little. Like when you're doing a heavy squat, it just feels like pressure everywhere. In the same way, if you're playing sports, you tend not to really be feeling lots of things unless something is going wrong. So that's kind of the same. I don't view exercise as totally distinct from all other things in the physical realm. So that's my starting point is, do I at least not feel the things that I definitely don't want to feel? I'm not going to hyper obsess over the sensation and those sorts of things in terms of the target tissue itself. When it comes to maybe the next layer, I would be a little bit concerned if like, someone was doing some kind of supposed chest exercise, and let's say they didn't feel the wrong things, but they also didn't really feel any fatigue in the target muscle. Well, that might just mean that that person needs to use more weights, apply higher degrees of effort. And so now all of a sudden we're having a totally different conversation. So that's where I would take it initially, is as long as we're not feeling the wrong things, I'm not super concerned about feeling the right thing. But overall, I think as long as we can look at these things from a physics-based perspective, we can kind of stay away from a lot of the sensation-based conversations, again, unless we're feeling something that we definitely don't want to.
I like that perspective. It basically fits my own bias, to be honest. So, if I were your client and I told you, Ben, whenever I try a chest press, I really feel my shoulders or I really feel my triceps. Of course, these are two separate issues, so the solutions are likely going to be different. What would you say to try and help me out?
So, from a generalized non visual perspective, what I would say is the first thing you always want to try to figure out is, can you connect at all with the muscle group you're trying to train before you start moving? A lot of people, I think, start to assume, or they have a starting point where they assume that they need to perform an exercise with full range of motion, with the range that they've seen everyone else use, with a lot of load and a lot of effort. Like, I need to do this thing that looks like, a bench press, for example, or a chest press on a machine. And it's not like it's a bad starting point, right? At least you're doing something that resembles a chest exercise. But I think it's a mistake to start from a place where you're trying to basically use the entire skill that you could be using. So, for example, if you're going all the way to the top, you're locking your elbows and you're getting as far back as is humanly possible. Well, you may be able to control some of that range, but why would you assume right out of the gate that you could just develop the whole skill all at once in one stroke, right? That's not how we approach any other skill in any other domain. Let's say, you're learning the guitar. The first thing that you do, you don't try to just immediately start playing a song, right? You have to learn the chords, you have to learn the notes, you have to learn about the relationship between those things. And you basically turn the song into more bite-sized chunks. So what I would say in the chest press example is, and this may sound a little bit weird and silly to people, but if they're on a machine or something, put a weight on the machine that's like heavier than you could use. And just in that starting position, be like, okay, when I push, is this like an elbow thing? Is this like a chest thing? Is this like a shoulder thing? What if I like move my grip outward a little bit? Oh, that felt worse. Let me move my grip inward. Oh my gosh, that felt much better. Maybe none of those things feel good, and maybe you can play around with raising the height of the seat, right? As long as you have a generalized sort of bite-sized approach of like, I'm going to take this thing bit by bit by bit, and I'm going to slow it down and try to basically interact with smaller chunks of the skill, you can build up from there. But what you can't do is you can't start with the full thing, cross your fingers, and just pray to God that like the right thing is going to happen. So that would be the first thing that I would recommend, is start by trying to manage the chunk of the exercise that you can manage. It doesn't have to be the example that I just gave. It could just simply be maybe just using the bottom half of the rep, right? Or even the top half of the rep. I don't even care. Just break the thing down into a smaller component part. That would be number one. Number two would be to pick exercises that are harder to mess up. Okay. So a good example of this would be like, let's say instead of barbell bench press, I might stick someone in a pec fly machine, or I might have them do a cable fly, where I'm really getting them to figure out, okay, what does it feel like for me to squeeze my chest? For people listening, you can imagine like, what does it feel like for me to squeeze my biceps inward toward one another with some kind of resistance that is opposing that action that I'm trying to create? So those are the two main things, is try to pick exercises that are more difficult to screw up. And of the exercises that you choose, try to make them more bite-sized instead of approaching them like you have to basically capture the entire skill immediately right off the bat with a challenging load. That's not how any skill development works in any domain, in any sport, or in any other, educational sphere. For example, you don't start out trying to learn all of physics in one day. You learn about what a force is, and then you learn about the properties of force and those sorts of things. So those are the first two things that come to mind, is just pick the safer options, the ones that are harder to screw up, and just sort of boil them down to smaller chunks that are more manageable for whatever your current skill level allows for.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then when, let's say that I'm trying that and I'm still finding that my shoulders seem to really take over, like that's all I feel on this exercise, then what would be the next step?
So hard to say from the perspective of the general, because as you're nodding your head to indicate, like, all of these things are person specific, client specific. The thing that makes you have shoulder pain may actually make the next person the thing, or may actually give another person an opportunity to only feel their chest, right? And so, people are different. What I would recommend in that instance is basically just much in the same way that if you're struggling to do anything, like, try to just take more guesses and more shots on goal. My personal experience working with both people who are in the general population and who are fitness professionals is a lot of times, and maybe this is your tendency too, because it's my tendency, is we'll try to do one thing, and then if that thing doesn't work, we're just going to spend an infinite amount of time to try to make it so that it will work, trying to sort of stick square pegs into round holes, so to speak. So my advice to people on a broad scale is just try not to think so rigidly in terms of I have to do this, I have to do that. This is black or white. If I do this thing, it won't target my chest as well. Try to remove attachments to exercises and exercise names, and just basically keep guessing with different options, because one of them is bound to feel better than the others, and that can be your starting point. So just as an example, let's say the pec fly machine thing doesn't work out for someone. They took my advice, they made it more of a bite-sized chunk. It's still not working out. They tried the squeezing thing. It still feels like crap. Well, maybe let's just like forget about the chest fly machine for now. Let's go over to the chest press machine that we were talking about earlier. Do all those adjustments still feel not good? Do all the bite-sized adjustments still not feel good? Cool. Let's go over to a bench and let's grab a pair of dumbbells. How does the 0 degree incline feel? Does it feel like crap still? Oh, maybe if I raise it to 15 degrees of an incline, that might feel better. Maybe I even raise it to 30 degrees and that feels better. Oh, does a dumbbell press not feel so good? Maybe I'm going to try a dumbbell fly. Right? So you see, like, at every turn, at every corner, you're still accomplishing the end goal, which is just put a force on my body that requires my pecs to contract. And then you're just basically taking different shots on goal, making different guesses until something feels better than something else. Because a lot of the times people pigeonhole themselves and think in these very rigid categories. In the case of the chest, it's always something like I have to barbell bench, I have to incline bench, whatever it happens to be. If those exercises work out for you, great. But don't be afraid to sort of step outside the box that you've accidentally constrained yourself into to begin with. Because a lot of people, myself included, they do the traditional things. They don't feel the things that other people say that they should feel. And then what happens is they assume that they themselves are in some way broken. They themselves are in some way dysfunctional, right? Whereas with anything else in life, nutrition is a good example, right? Oh, did that fruit not feel good on your stomach? Let's try this other fruit, because this other fruit also has fiber. It also has these micronutrients that we care about. So in the same way that I look at nutrition as a very squishy, like, there's no one size fits all thing, just understand that there's a million different exercises that you can do that are all amazing, equally effective exercises. And although they may be slightly different in the goals that they're accomplishing, it really doesn't matter until you can actually start to move in a direction at all.
I definitely like the exercise agnosticism because I personally view exercises as just tools in a toolbox with their pros and cons. There is no best exercise for any, well, as a one size fits all solution, essentially. So I appreciate that explanation. Now, if we're taking this a step further and we don't just want to hit the chest, you've made content in the past about biasing certain divisions of the pecs. You typically talk about two or three, so the upper, the mid, and the lower division. And I'm wondering, before we even get to the main question, my initial question is, how much of a difference does this make? Because I can easily see an overthinker starting to focus a little bit too much on, oh, this is supposed to be an upper pec exercise, but I'm feeling my lower pecs instead, and that's bad.
Right. So I would say imagine a scale of 0 to 10. On the scale of 0 to 10, 0 represents someone has very little to no training experience. 10 represents you're looking at Mr. Olympia, who has 300 pounds of muscle on stage and is 4% body fat. The closer that you get to a 10, the more that the specificity will matter. The closer that you get to a 0, the less the specificity will matter. So, case in point, I train my mom still. She's the only person that I have in my book. And for our chest exercise, we do push-ups. And over time, we have gone from a higher incline to a lower, lower, lower. Eventually, I'm going to work her. She's going to be upset about this. She's going to be on the floor eventually doing push-ups on the floor. Oh my gosh, mom, no way. Do I care about what part of my mom's chest she is feeling? No, not really. Do I even care if maybe she feels a little bit more front delt or a little more tricep than would be perfectly ideal? No, I don't, right? Because the minimum threshold required for her to get a valuable stimulus is very, very little. She's never lifted before. This is her first like real training cycle where she's actually progressing and load and reps and those sorts of things. However, if I'm training with my partner, who is, he's my training partner is a pro bodybuilder, he's got to be really specific about how much stress he puts through every fiber of his body. If he only does exercises which are going to target his lower chest, he might end up on stage with a big sort of maybe gap in his upper chest potentially, right? Just as a sort of theoretical example. More importantly than that, he may end up with some kind of overuse injury, some kind of injury that is maybe just caused by him sort of rinsing and repeating the same exact thing over and over and over again. So who you are and how much you've trained and what that training experience has been like for you matters more than anything else when it comes to this conversation. I would say a vast majority of people lean closer to the 0 compared to the 10. And I think a lot of people who are closer to the 0 make the mistake of assuming that they need what the person at the 10 needs. So again, this just goes back to our previous conversation about there's no hard rule around what exercises that you have to do for the chest and the pecs specifically. If you want to err on the side of caution in your exercise selection, just do all the chest exercises that you know that people have been doing for decades on decades on decades, right? These are your chest flies, these are your presses, these are your push-ups, these are your dips, right? The list goes on. Basically just something where you're pushing, and basically any exercise where you're trying to move something away from your body. All of the pecs, despite their differences, will be able to perform that action. And so as long as you're basically accomplishing that once, twice a week, for the most part, I think most people are going to be pretty good with that.
And if somebody wanted to go a little bit deeper and get a better understanding of how to set up chest exercises to bias one division over another, what would be your advice to target these different decisions in terms of divisions, in terms of the different setups involved?
So the first thing that I would say is it's important to understand that all of muscle contraction and muscle contraction response is based on the external force scenario. So if you took two extremes of this, right? One might be, okay, you're setting up and you're doing a dip exercise, which for people who don't know, it's basically a press where you're pressing at a downward angle, kind of like toward your nipple line or similar. That's one example. Another example on a different end of the extreme might be like an incline press, like a dumbbell incline press, a barbell incline press, something where you're pressing upward, maybe more toward your chin or your clavicle or somewhere in that range. Those are kind of two starting points, and the reason that they're different is because the force on your body is basically asking different muscles to recruit and respond in those scenarios. So a great starting point is kind of to divide your chest training into presses where you are pressing from a higher to a lower angle, i.e., again, your hands are maybe getting somewhere to your armpits, or it doesn't have to be that close, but in that direction. And then your biceps maybe are ending up somewhere close to your nipple line. And then alternatively, you would have some kind of press or some kind of fly, doesn't really matter, where you are doing something that is a little bit more low to high. So rather than high to low, where we're pressing down, we would be thinking more like an incline press where we're pressing low to high to target those upper chest fibers. So kind of intuitive on some level, in the sense that if you want to target the fibers that look more like they're going downward, do something that's more downward, right? If you're targeting something that looks like it's more of an upward fiber, right, do something that's more upward. And that would be a good starting point. Much in the same way, and maybe we'll talk about this, it would be good to do something like a pull down and a row as opposed to just one or the other. The chest works the same way. It would be wise, if you want, fully developed pecs, to do some kind of decline press and then some kind of incline press, again, to target the lower and the upper chest respectively.
That makes perfect sense. And I was going to talk about the back next. So that is a perfect segue. So the way I conceptualize the back is I typically think about it as the upper back musculature and then the lats as these two major muscle groups. So when it comes to training the lats, one very common cue that a lot of people use is squeeze the lats. And when I was starting out, I was like, squeeze my what now? And even when I Googled the lats, I was like, how do you squeeze that exactly? And so I'm wondering, when people are confused about that, how do you break that down for them?
So the first thing I'll say is, trainers who are listening, if trainers are listening, if you have a client, your client doesn't know what their lats are, nor do they care, nor do they know what squeezing their lats are, or what squeezing their lats even means. So yeah, I can resonate with that because I was told something very similar years ago. Hey, but maybe your clients care about where their lats are and what they're doing. Who am I to say? Some of my clients have in the past. Anyway, when we're thinking about the lats are, and I think this is just a cool sort of fun fact. The lats are these muscles basically that connect your hips and your spine to your shoulders. And from a evolutionary perspective, this is like the monkey muscle, right? This is basically the muscle that when monkeys, along with the chest to some degree, when monkeys are swinging on trees, right? And we're speaking or thinking in evolutionary terms, these are basically the group of fibers that prevents your arms from flying upward and sort of forward off of your body when you're hanging from something, right? So anyone who wants to test that, just like hang for a while, assuming your grip doesn't give out, and just kind of see what happens, right? Your lats are going to be the things to really anchor your entire shoulder girdle on your body. So instead of thinking about, say, squeezing your lats to contract them, I would draw people's attention more toward what their bones are doing. I have this saying that I like to communicate to the coaches that I work with, which is I highly advise that people coach bones rather than muscles, because muscles are basically just these things that respond, as I mentioned earlier, to the external force demands of a scenario. And what clients and what you yourself, as someone who likes to train, should probably think about are not the things that are occurring on the inside of the body. You want to think more about, like, what are the controllables that exist outside of the body that are very easy to see and navigate and locate. So squeezing your lats might become drive your elbow to the floor. Squeezing your lats might become drive your armpit to the floor. Squeezing your lats might be some kind of combination of those things. There are many different ways that you can essentially accomplish the same thing. But my advice as a starting point for people would be to focus on either their elbows and or their armpits, because both of those things are basically going to serve as the external representation of what the lats are ultimately going to do, which is basically, again, their function is to just pull the arm downward in a way that is close to your body. So among those bony cues, Again, I think most people would probably be best off imagining that they're guiding those motions through their elbow and that they're pulling with their elbow down to their back pocket. Make sure that when you are trying to do something that is lat focused, that your arm is also nice and tight to your body. So if you're doing a row, that doesn't mean pull your arms out wide to the side like you're making a T shape with your arms. It means pulling your elbows down to your front pockets or your back pockets so that your biceps are basically squeezed up against the sides of your rib cage. A pull down would function very similarly, although there are differences with pull downs. You would want to, instead of pulling super wide again to end up in that T shape, you would want to again pull just now more in a vertical direction, where if we're thinking about the bony segments and how they're moving, it's just like elbow to floor the whole way through, whether you're pulling down or you're allowing it to stretch on the way up. You want to be guiding the motion through the bones rather than just trying to think about, okay, how do I squeeze this thing that I don't really even know where it is? I think a lot of times, much as I was saying earlier about the 0 to 10 thing, is people will listen to, let's say, trainers, coaches, bodybuilders who are already at this 10, and they have a really good intuition about how to just instantly connect with the muscle. And what those people say is like, oh, I just squeeze my lat. That's how it happens. And that's where you can end up. But you first kind of, again, have to learn the individual notes and the individual chords, like we were talking about with guitar. And to me, that starts with focusing on bones in every motion that you can do. So if we want to basically make a comparison to the chest here, a comparison might be, instead of thinking about squeezing your pecs, you can do what I mentioned earlier about squeezing your biceps together. The biceps are like an external sort of landmark. You could also think more about squeezing your elbows together, right? About basically shoving your elbows toward your chin or shoving your elbows toward your lower nipples, right? All these concepts are principles that you can apply when you understand them in one circumstance to all other circumstances. So I'll stop it there, but the main takeaway is basically draw your attention to the external first, and then you can eventually work toward thinking about the internal once you kind of have a good grasp on what you're actually trying to accomplish.
So if for lats, you would suggest focusing on what your elbow is doing and keeping it close to the body and pulling it downwards towards your back pocket. If, on the other hand, we wanted to target more of the upper back musculature, what are some external cues that you would, or external aspects of the movement that you would point people's attention to?
Yeah, so I think elbows is another good one. I mean, elbows are going to kind of be just the end of the bone that you're ultimately guiding the motion through. So if you're doing a row, instead of elbows to back pockets, it's something more like elbows to the walls on either side of you, or elbows outward, or elbows wide, or elbows up, right? Just any number of those things can make a big difference. Same thing with pull downs, right? If you're doing some kind of pull down that you want to be more focused toward the upper back as compared to the lats, the principles are all the same. You're thinking more about driving your elbows in a sort of outward direction, both at the top and at the bottom, rather than driving them inward, down, and toward your rib cage. A last sort of comment on that and note is, there are different parts to the upper back, and so while we don't have to get into a level of specificity here on that topic, I would just say that there's no, just to repeat myself, there's no single way, there's no single cue, no single direction that you can give yourself that you can automatically know will be best. So if the elbows out thing doesn't feel super good to you, then maybe think about that cue from the perspective of your hands instead. Maybe, instead of pulling with the elbows on a bar, try to pretend like you're almost spreading the bar apart as you're pulling on it, right? Just you experimenting around with the same principle in different ways is a very good way to troubleshoot those kinds of things. And you could also maybe do it from the perspective of your shoulder blades, right? So maybe you are pulling wider and you're just feeling weird things, feeling the wrong things. Maybe you think more about your shoulder blades and what they're doing. Maybe you think about squeezing your shoulders together as you pull and allowing your shoulder blades to kind of spread apart as you work through the lengthening portion. So again, no one way to do it. I think just overall focusing on those kinds of principles of the external as a starting point, and then just knowing kind of what the general categories are of different exercises and what they accomplish. To this point, narrow equals more lats, wide equals more upper back. I think that's good for pretty much the vast majority of people who are going to be interested in training.
And since you've mentioned that obviously the upper back isn't just one muscle, but there are several. If somebody is in the position where they want to train recreationally, they want to build some muscle, but they don't need to become overtly obsessed about micromanaging whether they're hitting their lower trap or whether they're hitting more of their real delts, the way I would suggest they go about it is over time explore a variety of upper back focused exercises, and you're likely to cover all of these areas to a degree that makes sense for you who's not trying to micromanage. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think that's a great recommendation. And I think that overall, where people usually end up landing when they're following that direction is they end up with some kind of row, and they end up with some kind of pull down. And maybe, as a sprinkle on top, maybe they do some kind of like reverse fly, rear delt sort of a thing. For those people who maybe are not familiar with the reverse fly, it's also sometimes known as reverse pec deck. So instead of sitting with the chest on the pec deck, you face the other way and do it the opposite direction. But that's another example where, again, even though the motion looks like it's totally different from a row, your arms are still moving in that same wide path. It's just that there are distinctions with the resistance and those sorts of things. So row, pull down, reverse fly, that collection of stuff pretty much is going to cover all the things in the upper back. Even though it's complicated to describe, it's not complicated to apply.
I agree. And you keep leading me on to the next muscle that I want to cover. And you mentioned reverse flies for the rear delts, or they typically isolate the rear delts. And I was going to talk about the shoulders next, to where first I want to set the scene by explaining to you what I hear people talk about when they discuss the delts. And I hear people say that these days at least, you don't need that much pressing from the front delts or that much front delt work, rather, because it's typically covered in presses that involve the chest. Whereas if you want to grow wider, essentially, you want to focus on primarily on the lateral delts, and the rear delts are usually not even mentioned in the conversation, to be honest. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on this and on what makes the greatest visual difference to your physique when it comes to training the delts, in your view.
So I actually think the setup for this question is telling in terms of, because I do think that what you said reflects what most people say and what most people think. And I agree with some of it and I disagree with some of it. So just in my own opinions. So first thing is with the front delt, i.e. the front of the shoulder, that for people just trying to visualize, right, that's a muscle that is going to be active in literally any direction that you can press. So whether it's a dip, like for the lower chest we talked about, or an incline press for the upper chest, your whole front delt is just this annoying little pesky little guy that just is like, he's showing up to the party no matter what, right? No one wants him at the party, but he's coming to the party. So I personally, in my own training, I don't have any exercises that I'm like, this is a front delt thing, because it's just involved in so many different things. If someone, for example, though, was like doing a pec focused program that in some way was very, very non-front delt specific, then, what I would want to do is I would add volume there, but I won't spend a ton of time just trying to like dissect that. I'll just say that there are some instances in which I think people could use some front delt work in some specific populations. For instance, bikini competitors, they're always concerned about growing bigger delts relative to everything else. They're people who tend to need more front delt training. The side delt stuff is, I think, fairly accurate. I think of all the different portions of the delt, the side delt is the most relevant in terms of like creating a look that most people want, like a wider sort of V-taper look. Though what I would say is, given the nature of the delt and just how many different portions of the delt there are, and also how people's anatomy can really vary from person to person, both in terms of where certain muscles attach and also in terms of the bone structures that those muscles attach to, different people are going to lack different things naturally. So just to give a concrete example for me, I was never someone who had trouble growing the sort of front portion. We'll just call it the front half of my delt. We'll call it the front half of the middle delt and the front delt collectively. Just the stuff on the front, it just grew like wild from the second that I started lifting. However, the back half of the middle delt, my back half of my middle delt, And also my rear delt, those were just things that, based on the way that I naturally trained and naturally moved, uh, did not grow for the longest time. I was doing the reverse flies that people told me to do. I was doing the pull downs that people told me to do, and just all to no avail. So what I needed specifically was basically more work on that back half of the delt. And so that's what I've been really focusing on for the last, I don't know, maybe year or so. And it has made a humongous difference in, at least as far as I can see. Some people may dispute this, um, insofar as how I looked. So overall, I would say that in order of importance for myself, that was what I needed, more sort of middle rear delt. Some people may have the exact opposite problem, right? So overall, I just think it comes down to what kind of look you're trying to achieve. The one other thing that I will say is that, given that there is not a ton of discussion on rear delts, which is kind of weird because I often hear from people that like they have a very tough time, contracting their rear delts, making them sore, getting a pump in them. I actually think that the rear delts contribute a lot more than people think to overall shoulder size, mostly just because of the fact that, like, when you're doing some kind of like wider pose, I know that people listening can't watch, but just for you, like, people essentially will rotate their shoulders kind of like in this forward direction. And this bump on the back is actually what in many cases creates the shape of like roundness. So if I had to make a generalized sort of take on that, it would be people over focus on the side and under focus on the sort of back half stuff. And in terms of exercise selection for those tissues, certain types of reverse flies have been very beneficial to me. Single arm reverse flies in particular have been the most beneficial because you're able to kind of get your arm to stretch a little across your body. And then Y raise type exercises done with cables in particular. For people who are trying to visualize this, imagine what it would be like to do the YMCA, that dance. If you're I don't know if you're familiar with that, Nikias. Imagine you're just making a Y shape with your arms. Right? That Y shape with your arms, whether it's done with a cable or a dumbbell, that's going to be great for that sort of back half group that I was just mentioning. So that's my overall generalized take on the delts, and I think in summary, more people probably need the back half stuff than the front half stuff, just based on exercise selection, generally speaking, and what people tend to sort of naturally do.
That makes sense. I'm wondering about when it comes to the shoulder girdle, one muscle group that may not necessarily contribute to your physique, but that people talk a lot about is the rotator cuff. So I'm wondering, is there any benefit to training it? And there are a lot of rotator cuff exercises on the internet, but not all of them are necessarily useful. So I wondered about your take on the most useful ones for the average person.
So I think overall that the obsession with rotator cuff stuff has misled lots of people. And what I mean by that is, anytime that anyone seemingly has a shoulder issue, the first thing that they assume is, oh, it's the infraspinatus, it's the subscap. Oh no, my subscap, it's way too tight. Okay, there may be some validity to that. There may be some context I can imagine in which those applications might be useful. One of the things that people I think really need to realize is that your rotator cuff is basically a muscle group that by definition needs to be active during any upper body exercise, during any press, during any raise, during any pull down, during any row, during any reverse fly. Name your upper body exercise, your rotator cuff is there. So my generalized, and I highlight the word generalized here, my generalized bit of advice is, I just pretend that my rotator cuff doesn't exist, because I know it's basically getting, if I'm doing however many sets, if I'm doing, let's say, just pick an arbitrary number, let's say I'm doing 40 to 50 sets of like upper body stuff in a week, maybe even more, the rotator cuff and various parts of it are going to be active and needing to contribute substantially to basically just hold your shoulder in its socket. Like, that's basically the role of the cuff, is to make sure that your humeral head, the head of your upper arm bone, to make sure that it doesn't go anywhere. So with that said, that's my personal opinion and take for most people. There are some specific applications in which it might be necessary. For instance, I know someone who had a rotator cuff surgery, right? In that instance, that's a group that has been essentially compromised, that needs to essentially relearn how to do what it did before. So, any kind of internal and external rotation based activity with your arms at your sides is probably a decent place to start, despite what like a lot of the new age sort of people are saying about how rotator cuff exercises do nothing. Rotator cuff exercises train the rotator cuff, right? It's like pretty simple, straightforward. What I would say, however, is that there are some very common and easy to correct mistakes that people make with those. For instance, the first thing that people tend to do is they tend to go right into like a resistance band thing. It's not that resistance bands are bad, it's just that they're very load limiting. You can't select a load, you can't customize to some degree where you want resistance to be. So I would recommend doing something like a side lying dumbbell activity where the dumbbell is actually pulling your hand where you want it to be pulling you, not standing up. For just to repeat that, do not flop and flail your arms around to your sides. The resistance will not be acting against your shoulder in that case, really, or at least your rotator cuff. So like a side lying external rotation, internal rotation, even something like where your arms up and out to your side, where you're using some kind of bench to sort of prop your arm up. Dumbbell external rotations in that direction are great. So those sorts of things, just basically cables and dumbbells, and finding ways to conveniently support your upper arm, which typically just means underneath of your elbow, and just perform the internal and external rotations with, again, cables, dumbbells. Those are going to be, I think, great places to start and end if you're someone who's concerned about really recruiting those rotator cuff muscles specifically. But I'll repeat what I said earlier, which is that no exercise, no rotator cuff drill is a panacea for all muscles and all pains and all, quote unquote dysfunctions. And I would really caution people not to buy into particular narratives that suggest that anytime that they're experiencing pain, that something is broken, or that anytime they're experiencing pain, that something is weak or tight or unable to perform a job. Pain is just discomfort is just way more complex than that. And that's something that newer age physios are really coming to recognize and report. So just overall, I hope that kind of train of thought makes sense, and that's kind of what I would advise people do.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ben. I wanted to ask you if you think that we have enough time to cover biceps and triceps.
Yeah, for sure.
Awesome, because then we can wrap up the conversation on the upper body and then go home. And I'm wondering, let's start with the biceps. So on social media, there are new exercises for the biceps often popping up. Some people seem to overcomplicate biceps training. Some people might oversimplify it a little bit. What would be your advice on the most important aspects of execution to make sure that you are isolating the biceps?
So I'll try to keep these answers more rapid fire here so we can get through a good deal. Main things to focus on, as I mentioned earlier, you want some kind of resistance, whether it's a dumbbell, cable, or machine, or anything else, barbell, easy bar. You want some kind of resistance that's trying to straighten your elbow. So this is your typical standing dumbbell curl. Number one. Number two, you want something behind the bottom of your upper arm. Generally speaking, not like, all of a sudden the curl is just going to become a waste of time if you don't. But for those listening, you can picture maybe a preacher curl. If you know what a preacher curl is, that is the sort of quintessential example of stable biceps exercise. So number one, you want some kind of resistance that is straightening your elbow, trying to pry it apart. And number two, you want something behind your upper arm, which is to say kind of on the bottom of the triceps. If you can basically find maybe 2 or 3 curling variations, or even 1 to 2 that check those boxes, that you can progress week to week, maybe twice a week if biceps are a priority, 1 on each day, and just progress those without elbow pain. Those are going to be the main selections that I would advise. And if you wanted to be, let's just say, a little bit more concerned with nuance, maybe one of those curls is done with your arms at your side, and one of those curls is done kind of with your arms in front of your body. So that might be something like, a cable curl with your arm at your side, supported by something like the cable column itself. And it might be something like a machine preacher curl or a dumbbell preacher curl. And both of those things are checking both of those boxes, at least in a generalized sense.
What are your thoughts on the grip, whereby People used to say that if you had a hammer grip, then you would target more of the brachioradialis versus having the typical grip, then you would target more of the actual biceps.
So I would just agree with that. Most people aren't even aware that they have these other elbow flexors, these other elbow benders. So much of the time, if people don't care about them, I just don't even, I didn't even mention them. But I have come to care about them more over time. I would say I do think it makes a difference to do something like a hammer curl. So if I had to maybe add some icing on the cake here, I would say do a curl with your palm where your palm is pointing to your body, and then do a different curl where your palm is maybe pointing away from you or toward the other palm. So my favorite exercise option for that as of late is just a rope curl. Grab a rope, basically just use a hammer grip on the rope and just pull to your face. Great for the other elbow flexors, which are known as the brachialis and the brachioradialis, as you mentioned. And yeah, palm to the face for biceps always.
That makes sense. What about triceps? What are your main considerations to train them effectively?
So triceps, unlike the biceps, they do not need as much support from the external world. Many reasons for that. The simplest of which is just that something like a triceps pushdown, let's say, with a rope, one of my favorites. It's really easy just to kind of hold your arms at your sides because you have your chest and you have your lats to basically just hunker down your shoulder girdle. So you just have bigger muscles to basically hold you in those positions. And much like the biceps, I kind of follow a similar model. So I do some kind of tricep thing where my arms are at my sides, and then I do some kind of tricep thing where my arms are either in front of my body or over my head somewhere. So for me, this can be pretty simple. It's just like, let's do a rope push down maybe on one day, and then on another day, we'll do a rope overhead extension. And just by simply changing the arm position, you're basically covering, let's say, all the different things you would want to in relation to targeting the different heads of the triceps. Though I do think that, much like the discussion around fancy biceps variations, none of that stuff really ends up coming out, at the end of the day. It's like, I'm not walking around seeing people who have like only one part of their triceps developed. It's like all of them tend to come along for the ride, with very few exceptions, though I have seen them. So overall, same model, same application. I tend to prefer using cables for triceps in particular, just because it's easier to manipulate force direction with cables as compared to dumbbells. And with dumbbells, ends up feeling a little bit clunky, unstable. With the overhead extension, it's kind of like you got to haul a big dumbbell over the back of your head. That can be annoying. So I prefer cables for triceps for that reason. And again, just kind of one at the side, one with the arms in front or overhead, just like with the biceps.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I'm impressed. We covered all of the upper body essentially, so we made really good use of this time. And to wrap up the conversation, I want to ask if there's anything that you don't think we touched on in enough detail or anything that you want to leave the audience with, Ben.
I mentioned a couple times throughout this discussion, only really in like alluding to this topic, but I really think it's important for people to take a physics first framework to exercise. And I'll just spell out briefly why that is. The first is just purely practical, which is that if you understand the basic physics of exercise, then you don't need to guess. You don't need to throw stuff at the fan to try to, just see if something will stick, essentially. You can basically just understand like you would if you were an engineer creating some really much more complicated machine or something. You would basically be able to sort of map it out in your head and say, okay, here's my goal. Here are the physics that I need to know to essentially apply this stuff. And then boom, out the other end, you get the output, right? So if you're struggling with an exercise and exercise selection, the solution to that is always going to be somehow rooted in physics. That's the first thing. To go along with that, when it's understood that all this stuff is basically just us interacting with the external forces of the world, when you take that perspective, what happens is you kind of lose a focus on all of like the opinions and beliefs that you have about yourself and your body. And I just think like with the advent of social media, like people have become more and more and more hyper-focused and pathologized and concerned about how does this thing look? How does that thing look? How does this thing feel? Is this broken? Am I a broken person? Is this body part broken? And all of that stuff is born through people's experience of exercise, right? So if someone says, if you can't do a squat ass to grass, then you're dysfunctional and you can't do that, well, then you're just going to go on believing that until you run into, some other opinion, hopefully my opinion right now. And my opinion is basically like, what we should be trying to do is we should be trying to fit exercises to people's bodies. We should not be trying to sort of stick people into these rigid categories and force them to do particular things because other people have said that those things are important. So my perspective is understanding the physics stuff is super practical in terms of you just being able to get what you want out of exercise, but it also frees you from like the shackles of emotional attachment to exercise because you realize that all of it is just based on how you set up forces and how high of a force you use. So if you have discomfort in this thing, it doesn't mean you're broken. It just means that you have to do something else, right? Whether that just be lightening the load or lessening the range of motion or whatever it happens to be, you could do a million different things. But when you take this physics first lens, as opposed to the sort of emotional human lens that we by default sort of do, you can remove yourself from all that stuff and you can remove all the negative experiences and aspects to training that are just unnecessary and in most cases harmful. So I really just don't want people to feel like they're broken because they can't do this thing that someone else said that they should do, because that, to me at least, in my experience, was very freeing. And I hope that many people who are in my old shoes can recognize that just on account of this conversation and on that perspective.
Thank you, Ben. That's an excellent bow to tie the podcast with. And now, as we finish off, can you let people know where they can connect with you? And I'll put all of the links in the show notes of the episode.
Yeah, main place to find me is on my Instagram. Just type in my name, as I'm sure you'll link, and everything can be found through there.
Perfect. So I'll just put in the Instagram account. Well, I'll put the Instagram account in the show notes. And on that note, Ben, thank you very much for coming on the podcast. Dear listeners, thank you for tuning in, and I will talk to you next time.
Thank you.
Lastly, if you want to support the podcast and help me reach more people, please leave a 5-star rating or review on any podcast platform that you're using. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll speak to you soon.